Creative tech projects come in a lot of different forms and can be built with a variety of different tools. My own experience is mostly in TouchDesigner, but the topics that we're going to be covering apply to creative tech in general. Most of the projects that I've worked on or seen other people work on fall into a couple of broad categories. We're going to go through each of these categories and talk a bit about how to handle them. I'll preface this by saying that this is all based on what I've encountered and how I do things. You may have a totally different experience, and if so, leave some comments. I would love to hear more about how you're doing things. The place most people start is with what I call one-off projects. These are completely self-contained things that produce some kind of output, possibly with sensors or data source or some other kind of input or whatever. They're a great way to learn. And in fact, most of the TouchDesigner tutorials that are out there kind of fit into this category. And they're great because at the end of it, you have something that you can show and, you get that sense of accomplishment, which is great. In these projects, the goal is just to make the thing work and look the way you want it to look. You don't necessarily do a lot of planning. And often, once things get to the point where they're working, you might not bother to revise things and just kind of leave it once it's in a good state. Like most people, this is how I started with TouchDesigner. My work would typically be like a single TouchDesigner file, possibly with a few other assets like images or text files or whatever. I'd open the file and it would start doing the thing, whatever that was, which is usually rendering something or, producing video that you could show on a projector or something like that. These projects are great for a lot of things, but there are some limits to this approach. They typically aren't very flexible and often aren't easy to modify or extend, and they might be prone to instability. Many times I have seen a one-off project end up being used for something just slightly beyond what the original purpose was, and then break to the point where large portions of it have to be rebuilt. And I've spent far too many hours trying to debug issues in projects that weren't designed to be fixable or extensible. Over the years, I was making a series of these one-off projects, and I started to want to bring things along from earlier projects when I would start a new one. So each project would add features and build out the tools that make it easier to work with. I typically had a panel that I would put kind of on the side of the network editor with buttons to do common stuff like opening an output window or, recording a video file. And I eventually started to add control panels to that with sliders for important parameters. This is around when I started building what I'm calling system projects. The big turning point was when I started building long-term installations. And these were typically for, video panels on buildings or, lobbies of hotels or whatever. And for projects of that scale, you kind of have to do some planning. So I would organize things into a structure. I'd kind of think about ahead of time what all the different parts were going to be and build things in that arrangement. And I would create a collection of reusable components that would get cloned across the rest of the project. And I would even spend time writing documents that lay out the requirements. And that process of figuring out requirements was pretty critical to getting things to work well and for getting things to do what the client wants. And more importantly, to make the client figure out what they want. And when you're doing this, you need to figure out what all the possible conditions are and then how you're going to handle each one of those. So for an interactive sensor piece, there are going to be times when there's nobody there. So it should do something in kind of an idle state. Or for something that has a daily schedule, figuring out what all the phases of the day are and what should be going on for each of those. If you're doing something for sunset, is that just like a single moment in time, or is that like a span of time in which the sun is setting? All kinds of different things. And if you just kind of make assumptions about those, a lot of the time you'll find out that that doesn't line up with what the client was thinking, and then you'll have to go back and redo things. So I found it really helpful to go through and lay that all out in writing, and obviously there are going to be changes to that over the course of the project, but at the end of it, you still end up with this document that says, like, this is how it behaves. And if it's not doing that, something's wrong. When I'm making aesthetic content in this context, I try to think about all the things that a client or a creative director might ask for. And even if they assure me that they definitely won't need to crossfade between two scenes or, show two different shapes instead of one, you kind of have to guess at whether that's actually going to be requested a couple of days later, and then you're going to have to redo things, or whether it makes sense to kind of build in those assumptions and the flexibility ahead of time, anticipating that they're probably going to change their mind about stuff. Unlike with one-off projects, systems are designed not only to, do the thing, they're also designed to be worked on. And that often means, naming things clearly and organizing them well, and actually get into naming more in a recent video. If you can check that out if you're interested. Even if I'm the only developer on the project, I'm still typically going to be working on it for a month or two. And that's going to mean that I'm going to end up needing to look at things that I haven't touched in a few weeks and then be able to just jump right in and change things or add stuff or do whatever it is that needs to be done. And if you're on a team, becomes even more important because you need to make sure that people, understand stuff that they didn't build. Clear naming is like the bare minimum threshold that you need to hit for something like that. Even better than that would be, proper documentation. Then there's what I call dynamic systems, which are kind of like another tier of system project, or like a kind of even more organized and complicated version of a system project. And these typically involve things like running lots of instances across a bunch of different computers that talk to each other over a network, and, dynamically load things when they start up and have different configuration files and all that stuff. At least for me, in most of the situations that I typically encounter in my work, that level of complexity often isn't worth it. I do use kind of elements of that approach, but not to the extent that some people in the Touch community do. I'll put some links in the description to some resources that get into more detail about those types of projects. I really like building the kind of system projects. They just appeal to me in terms of like the kinds of work that I like doing. And, I like building out those structures and figuring out all the different possible cases. But I have found that getting too stuck in that mindset can be kind of limiting. Simply put, doing more stuff or doing it, in the right way often takes longer, at least in the short term, than just kind of tossing something together. So after years of really focusing on the system stuff, I found that I had kind of lost an essential element of the creative process. And my solution to that is what I call experiments. They're sort of a variation of the one-off project approach, where you don't bother to try to make them fully functional. Like often they'll just be able to record video files or something, but like at least mine typically don't have, MIDI controls or a UI or stuff like that. The purpose of these is just to try stuff. And that stuff might not work out, or it might be really neat, or it might, spawn another idea and you might, fork it off and create a variant of that or something. For this kind of work, I make an intentional effort not to spend time planning things or naming them appropriately. So the networks for these are often really tangled messes, but that's okay. And to kind of reinforce this, I don't even try to like name the files beyond just like cube thing 4 or whatever. And because of the kind of chaotic nature of the workflow, like I'll often end up with a file called cube thing 4 that like doesn't have anything even remotely close to cubes, but it did at one point in the past, but doesn't matter. The purpose is not to, create like an art installation. The purpose is just to try some stuff and see if it looks good. The main thing to keep in mind with experiments, and I cannot stress this enough, experiments are not finished pieces. I do not use them for installations or performances or anything like that. If it seems like one of them could, evolve into something more, then I just accept the fact that I'm going to need to either rebuild it from scratch or at least spend a bunch of time cleaning it up. This can often be really confusing to clients in commercial jobs. They'll see something that, it runs and it does stuff and it looks good in one very specific arrangement, and they figure that it must be done. It's basically ready, right? Like it looks mostly right. We can just kind of refine it and that's all it's going to take, right? This is the point where you kind of have to make a choice. You can either try to just kind of hack away at it to get it to do what the client wants, you know, changing little parts of it and trying to keep the rest the same because you know that it isn't really going to work well if you change too much stuff there. So you kind of try to keep your changes isolated or whatever. In my experience, this is almost always a bad idea, especially for installations that are going to be there for, even like a couple of hours. The changes that come up in that refinement process are never as simple as they seem, and they're never as simple as, a creative director or a client thinks they're going to be. And trying to work in really messy projects can be slow and unpleasant. And the projects may not even be designed in a way that can be extended in the way that, the client wants. Like if you do something that's kind of 2D composite that looks like a 3D scene and like it looks right for that one case, and then the client says, okay, but can you rotate the thing? And like, that's not how that works. We have to rebuild it. Projects like this that make it out into the real world in long-term installations can become maintenance nightmares, which can stress you out for years. Trust me, not good. Like 10 plus years in one case. The alternative is just to accept that cost of cleanup and say that, we have a prototype. We can use this for inspiration, but like this is not a finished piece and we're going to have to put more work in to get it to the point where it's like safe to release out into the world. And for long-term projects, especially, it's worth putting that time in. I recently made a series of videos about what I call scenes. They're kind of like distinct visual looks that, are stored in separate TOX files. For something like a VJ performance, these could act like the clips that you load and switch between. Or for, a long-term installation, they might be like different modes that it goes into. So, there's like a day look and a night look or something like that. In some cases, you can treat the workflow with the content of those scenes kind of like experiments. They can be a little bit less organized as long as that disorder stays kind of contained within the scene and doesn't leak out into the rest of a larger system project. This can also be a good way to split up work if you have a team of people where like some people are working just on content and, they make the component, do the thing, it looks good. That's kind of the end of that. And then somebody else is focusing on the whole thing that goes around that, loads up those scenes and like, fades them in and fades them out and does all the other stuff that kind of goes around that. And like all of that other part of the project can be really structured and named and organized. And the contents of the scenes doesn't necessarily have to be. And since that's often a more intuitive workflow to just kind of like toss stuff in and make it look good, that might be a good way to kind of allow some of the people on the team to work the way that they like while still keeping an overall structure to the project. If you want to learn more about that scene approach and, some ways to load them up into projects and how to use them, recommend checking out the videos in that series. So let's recap. One-offs are a great way to learn, and they're a great way to make small pieces that might get used for simpler installations or performances. They're kind of by definition, maybe a little sloppy, but you can start it, it runs, it does a thing. That's close enough. Systems take longer, but are really important for anything beyond that scale and are absolutely critical if there are multiple people involved in the project, or even if like it's just you, but you're going to be working on it for more than a couple of weeks. kind of dynamic systems are useful for like very specific types of problems. Like if you have lots of different machines that are each doing different things, then, you know, doing that kind of like dynamically structured, complicated process will often make sense at that level. And experiments are how you try stuff and grow as an artist, but seriously, they are not ready for production. But, they're still pretty satisfying to work on. Anyway, I hope this was helpful in figuring out how to approach different types of projects. I'll probably end up doing more detailed dives into the elements of each of these, or at least the elements of systems, because experiments don't really have elements, but whatever. If you like this video and you want to support me making more of them, consider subscribing to my Patreon. You'll get exclusive downloads and early tutorial access and a bunch of RayTK stuff and Discord and all that. And even if you don't feel like paying, you can subscribe for free as a way to get announcements about new tutorials and, RayTK releases and that kind of thing. Thanks for watching, and make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification setting.